The answer to what makes an avoidant obsessed isn't what most people expect. It's not being more understanding of their need for space. It's not being more patient with their patterns. It's not accommodating their limitations or minimizing your needs to make them comfortable. These strategies might keep an avoidant around, but they don't create obsession. They create complacency. The avoidant becomes comfortable knowing you'll wait, knowing you'll accept breadcrumbs, knowing you'll organize your life around their availability. What actually triggers obsession in an avoidant is the opposite of what you've been doing. It's your unavailability when they expect availability. It's your emotional independence when they're accustomed to your need for them. It's your boundaries when they're used to your flexibility. It's your genuine indifference when they're expecting your continued investment. The avoidance psychology is wired to pursue what feels scarce and to take for granted what feels abundant. When you stop being readily available, when you stop centering your life around them, when you stop waiting hopefully for their inconsistent presence, you activate a part of their attachment system that rarely engages during the relationship. You trigger their fear of abandonment, the very fear their avoidant patterns have been designed to protect against. And in that activation, they experience something they haven't felt before, the desperate need to secure your continued presence, the anxiety about losing access to you, the compulsion to pursue rather than be pursued. This shift creates what looks like obsession, but is actually the avoidance attachment anxiety, finally surfacing because for the first time you're not guaranteed, the unavailability that triggers their pursuit system. The most powerful trigger for avoidant obsession is your unavailability, but not the kind that's performed or strategic. The avoidant can sense when you're playing games, when you're creating artificial distance to manipulate their behavior, when your unavailability is a tactic rather than genuine redirection of your energy and attention. What triggers obsession is authentic unavailability that emerges from you genuinely building a life that doesn't revolve around them. From you investing your time and energy in pursuits that fulfill you independent of the relationship. From you becoming so engaged with your own existence that the avoidance, presence, or absence stops determining your emotional state or schedule. This unavailability manifests first in your time. You're no longer automatically available for them. When they reach out after a period of distance, you're not immediately responsive because you're genuinely busy with your own life. You have plans that don't include them. You have commitments that take priority. You have a schedule that's full, not because you're trying to make them jealous, but because you've stopped organizing your life around the possibility of their availability. This shift is disorienting for the avoidant who has grown accustomed to you being ready to engage whenever they emerge from their withdrawal. Suddenly, access to you requires planning, coordination, and fitting into your schedule rather than you fitting into theirs. The unavailability that triggers pursuit also includes emotional unavailability that replaces your previous emotional investment. You're no longer checking in on them constantly, no longer seeking updates about their life, no longer making efforts to maintain emotional connection during their withdrawal phases. You've redirected that emotional energy toward yourself, toward friendships, toward pursuits that actually reciprocate your investment. When the avoidant resurfaces expecting your usual warmth and engagement, they encounter a version of you that's pleasant, but no longer intensely focused on them. This emotional distance creates discomfort for the avoidant because they've relied on your emotional availability as a constant even while they were inconsistent. Your unavailability becomes particularly triggering when the avoidant realizes you're not waiting for them anymore. You're not in suspended animation during their withdrawal. You're living fully, experiencing joy, building connections, pursuing goals. The avoidant has operated under the assumption that their absence creates a void in your life that only their return can fill. Discovering that you've filled that void yourself, that you're thriving without them, that you've stopped needing their presence to feel complete, activates their pursuit system because it means they're losing relevance in your life. The fear of becoming irrelevant to someone they value triggers anxiety that overrides their usual discomfort with pursuit. The unavailability that triggers obsession also includes you being unavailable for the patterns that used to define the relationship. You're not available to accept breadcrumbs anymore. You're not available for late-night texts that lead nowhere. You're not available for vague plans that may or may not materialize. You're not available to accommodate their inconsistency, to tolerate their emotional distance, to accept their minimal effort. This unavailability for dysfunction forces the avoidant to either step up with genuine effort or lose access entirely. Many avoidants faced with this binary choice discover capacity for pursuit they didn't know they possessed, because the alternative, losing you, completely activates fears they've been avoiding their entire life. Your unavailability becomes obsession-inducing when it's consistent rather than fluctuating. The avoidant can't manipulate you back into availability with temporary increases in effort. You maintain your unavailability regardless of their behavior because it's not a strategy to control them, it's your genuine life structure. Now you've built something that works for you, that fulfills you, that doesn't require their participation. This consistency is crucial because it communicates that your unavailability isn't a phase or a test. It's your new reality, and if they want access to you, they need to adapt to that reality rather than waiting for you to return to your previous patterns of organizing around them. The unavailability also extends to your future. You're not available to wait indefinitely for them to be ready for commitment, for consistency, for the relationship to progress. You're moving forward with your life, making decisions, pursuing opportunities, building toward goals that may or may not include them. This forward movement without guaranteed space for them creates urgency for the avoidant. They realize that time is not infinite, that your availability is not permanent, that if they don't claim their place in your life actively, you'll build a life where there's no longer room for them. This recognition can trigger intense pursuit as the avoidant scrambles to secure their position before it's lost entirely. The unavailability that creates obsession is particularly powerful when the avoidant sees evidence that you're happy, fulfilled, and complete without them. They're accustomed to being pursued by people who are incomplete without them, who need them to feel whole, who organize their emotional well-being around the avoidant's presence. But when they encounter someone who is genuinely whole on their own, who treats the relationship as enhancement rather than necessity, who can be happy with or without them, it triggers something profound. The avoidant recognizes that they're not essential to your happiness, which paradoxically makes them desperate to become essential, to prove their value, to secure their importance in your life through pursuit and effort they've never demonstrated before. Your unavailability ultimately triggers obsession because it activates the avoidant's fear of abandonment that their distancing strategies have been designed to prevent. The avoidant maintains emotional distance to protect themselves from being left. But in doing so, they often push away people who actually want to stay. When you become unavailable, when you stop pursuing, when you redirect your energy elsewhere, the avoidant faces the very abandonment they've been fearing. And this triggers their attachment system to override their avoidant patterns. The obsession you witness isn't a sudden transformation of their personality. It's their anxiety about loss finally exceeding their anxiety about loss, finally exceeding their anxiety about intimacy, causing them to pursue, because the threat of losing you has become more frightening than the vulnerability of claiming you. The emotional independence that challenges their control. The second element that makes an avoidant obsessed is your emotional independence, your capacity to maintain stable well-being, regardless of their behavior, your refusal to make them responsible for your emotional state. Throughout most relationships with avoidance, partners become emotionally dependent in ways that give the avoidant control. Your mood fluctuates with their availability. Your security depends on their reassurance. Your happiness requires their presence. This emotional dependency, while it might feel like love or attachment, actually allows the avoidant to remain comfortable in their patterns because they can regulate the relationship by managing their distance. When you're emotionally dependent, the avoidant knows exactly how to keep you engaged without giving too much. Emotional independence disrupts this dynamic entirely. When your emotional state stabilizes independent of the avoidance behavior, when their withdrawal no longer sends you into anxiety spirals, when their return no longer creates euphoric relief, the avoidant loses their primary mechanism of control. They can no longer use distance to manage your emotions or proximity to reward your patience. Your emotional consistency forces them to confront that their usual strategies aren't working, that they can't predict or control your responses anymore, that the power dynamic they've relied on has fundamentally shifted. This loss of control is deeply unsettling for the avoidant and often triggers obsessive focus on you as they try to understand and reestablish the familiar dynamic. Your emotional independence manifests in how you respond to their withdrawal. Instead of becoming anxious, pursuing them, or expressing hurt that gives them power, you remain calm and continue focusing on your own life. This response is confusing to the avoidant because they expect withdrawal to create reaction. When it doesn't, when you seem genuinely unaffected by their distance, the avoidant experiences cognitive dissonance. Their behavior, which has always produced predictable results, no longer does. This unpredictability is uncomfortable enough that the avoidant often increases their efforts to elicit the familiar response, pursuing you more intensely in an attempt to restore their sense of control over the relationship's dynamics. The emotional independence that triggers obsession also includes you no longer seeking validation or reassurance from the avoidant. You've developed enough internal security that you don't need their approval, their affirmation, or their presence to feel confident in your worth. This independence is threatening to the avoidant because being the source of someone else's validation has been a key part of how they maintain connection while keeping distance. They could dole out validation sparingly, creating scarcity that kept you seeking more. But when you stop seeking it from them, when you validate yourself or find validation elsewhere, the avoidant recognizes they're losing their leverage. This recognition often triggers increased effort to regain that position of being needed for your sense of worth. Your emotional independence also means you're no longer managing the avoidant's emotions for them. You're not tiptoeing around their sensitivities, moderating your needs to protect their comfort, or absorbing their emotional unavailability without expression. You express your feelings honestly without concern for whether they'll trigger the avoidance withdrawal. You state your needs clearly without softening them to make the avoidant comfortable. This directness and authenticity forces the avoidant to either engage with the emotional reality of the relationship or lose access to you. Many avoidants, when faced with this choice, discover they're more capable of emotional engagement than they believed because the alternative, your departure, is unacceptable. The emotional independence that creates obsession includes you being unaffected by the avoidant's hot and cold behavior. Their warmth doesn't make you overflow with hope. Their coldness doesn't make you spiral into despair. You maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of their fluctuations because you've stopped making their behavior mean something about you. The avoidance distance means they're uncomfortable with intimacy, not that you're unworthy. The avoidance warmth means they're feeling safer in the moment, not that the relationship has fundamentally changed. This clear-sighted perspective protects you from the emotional roller coaster while simultaneously making you fascinating to the avoidant, who can't understand how you maintain stability while they're fluctuating wildly. Your emotional independence also manifests in your relationship to the outcome of the relationship itself. You're no longer desperately invested in making it work at all costs. You prefer it to work You care about the avoidant, but you're genuinely okay if it doesn't, because you know your happiness doesn't depend on this specific relationship succeeding. This outcome independence is perhaps the most triggering aspect of emotional independence for the avoidant. They're accustomed to people who need the relationship to work, who will bend themselves into pretzels to make it succeed, who will accept minimal effort because having the avoidant in some capacity is better than not having them at all. Your willingness to walk away if your needs aren't met communicates that you value yourself more than you value the relationship. And this self-valuation often triggers intense pursuit as the avoidant realizes they must step up or lose you entirely. The emotional independence that creates obsession also includes you having a rich emotional life that doesn't center on them. You have deep friendships, meaningful work, engaging hobbies, spiritual practices, or creative outlets that provide emotional fulfillment. The avoidant is no longer your primary source of emotional experience, which means their presence or absence affects you less dramatically than when they were your main focus. This decentralization of their importance in your emotional landscape is both threatening and attractive to the avoidant. Threatening because they're losing their position of centrality, attractive because people with rich internal lives are inherently more interesting and valuable as partners than people whose entire existence revolves around one relationship. The boundaries that create the space they claim to need. The third element that makes an avoidant obsessed is your implementation of firm boundaries that paradoxically give them exactly what they've claimed to want, while simultaneously making them uncomfortable with having it. The avoidant has spent the relationship explaining that they need space, that they require autonomy, that they can't handle pressure or expectations. They framed your needs as demands and your desires for consistency as violations of their boundaries. But when you finally establish boundaries that create the space they've insisted on needing, when you stop pursuing and give them the autonomy they've claimed is essential, the avoidant often discovers that what they actually wanted was the option to have space, not the reality of you respecting that space so completely that they become irrelevant to your daily existence. The boundaries that trigger obsession begin with you no longer tolerating breadcrumbs. When the avoidant reaches out after days or weeks of silence with minimal effort, a vague text, a late-night message, a half-hearted suggestion of getting together sometime, you don't respond with the enthusiasm and relief they've come to expect. Instead, you either don't respond at all, or you respond with matching energy, pleasant but uninvested. This boundary communicates that your time and attention have value, that access to you requires genuine effort, that you're not available for the kind of low-investment connection the avoidant prefers. This forces the avoidant to either increase their effort substantially or accept that they're losing access to you, and many avoidants choose increased effort when faced with this reality. The boundaries that create obsession include you refusing to have the same conversations repeatedly without action. When the avoidant acknowledges their patterns, expresses intention to change, but then continues the same behavior, you don't engage with the words anymore. You observe the actions and make decisions based on those. This boundary prevents the avoidant from using verbal acknowledgement as a substitute for behavioral change. They can no longer talk their way out of accountability, can no longer buy more time with promises that never materialize. This forces them to either demonstrate genuine change through sustained different behavior or lose credibility entirely. And the recognition that words alone won't maintain your engagement often triggers increased behavioral effort. Your boundaries also include ending interactions when they become disrespectful or when the avoidance behavior crosses lines you've established. If the avoidant becomes defensive, dismissive, or stonewalls during important conversations, you don't continue engaging. You simply disengage calmly and redirect your attention elsewhere. This boundary protects you from the emotional damage of continued engagement with someone who isn't showing up appropriately, but it also communicates to the avoidant that their behavior has consequences. They can no longer treat you poorly while knowing you'll remain engaged trying to fix things. This recognition that their behavior determines their access to you often motivates the avoidant to regulate themselves better because the alternative, your absence, is unacceptable. The boundaries that trigger obsession also include you being unavailable during times you've previously been consistently available. If you are always free on weekends, always responsive in evenings, always making space in your schedule for the avoidant's last-minute plans, you stop. You fill that time with your own activities, commitments, and relationships. When the avoidant expects to slot into your schedule easily and discovers they can't, when they find that access to you requires advanced planning and coordination, it creates urgency. The ease they've taken for granted disappears, and suddenly maintaining connection with you requires effort they haven't had to exert before. This shift from easy access to requiring genuine pursuit often activates the avoidant's desire to secure their position more firmly. Your boundaries around emotional energy also create obsession by forcing the avoidant to either reciprocate or lose access. You stop being the only one initiating meaningful conversations. You stop being the only one checking in, expressing care, or maintaining emotional connection. You offer what you receive, matching their energy rather than always giving more in hopes they'll eventually match you. This mirroring forces the avoidant to confront what they've been contributing or not contributing to the relationship. When they want more from you and realize they must first give more to receive it, many avoidants discover capacity for emotional effort they've never demonstrated because the equation has changed from you giving freely to them having to earn what you provide. The boundaries that make an avoidant obsessed include clear communication about what you need from partnership and willingness to walk away if those needs can't be met. You're not negotiating about your fundamental requirements for consistency, presence, and emotional availability. You're stating them clearly and allowing the avoidant to decide whether they can meet them. This boundary is powerful because it removes the ambiguity the avoidant has hidden behind. They can no longer claim they didn't know what you needed or that your expectations were unclear. They face a clear choice: develop capacity to meet your stated needs or lose the relationship. This clarity often triggers obsessive focus as the avoidant grapples with a decision they can no longer avoid or defer indefinitely. Your boundaries also include protecting yourself from the emotional roller coaster of the avoidance approach and withdrawal cycles. You no longer ride those waves with them, experiencing highs when they're close and lows when they're distant. You maintain your own emotional equilibrium, and if their cycling becomes too destabilizing, you create more distance to protect yourself. This self-protective boundary communicates that you value your own well-being more than you value maintaining connection with someone whose patterns harm you. The avoidant, recognizing that their patterns are pushing you away rather than keeping you engaged, often becomes obsessed with finding ways to maintain connection that don't trigger your self-protective distance. The boundaries that trigger obsession ultimately work because they create the conditions the avoidant claims to want, while removing the comfort those conditions have provided. The avoidant wanted space. Your boundaries give them space by not pursuing when they withdraw. The avoidant wanted autonomy. Your boundaries give them autonomy by building your own life independent of them. The avoidant wanted reduced pressure. Your boundaries eliminate pressure by removing expectations they need to meet. But in receiving these conditions, the avoidant discovers that what they actually wanted was the security of your continued pursuit, while maintaining their distance, the comfort of your emotional investment while they remained unavailable, the safety of knowing you were waiting while they decided whether to engage. Your boundaries remove that safety, creating genuine stakes where losing you is a real possibility rather than an abstract threat. And these stakes often trigger the pursuit and obsession that emerge when the avoidant finally faces consequences for their patterns. The authentic indifference that activates their abandonment fears. The final and most powerful element that makes an avoidant obsessed is your authentic indifference. Your genuine arrival at a place where you're no longer emotionally invested in the outcome, where you truly don't care whether the avoidance stays or goes, where your well-being is so firmly established, independent of them, that their presence becomes optional rather than central. This isn't performed indifference designed to manipulate their behavior. It's not strategic distance calculated to make them jealous. It's the real psychological state that emerges when you've done enough healing and growth that the avoidance simply doesn't occupy the emotional space they once did, where you've genuinely moved on even if you're still technically in contact with them. Authentic indifference manifests in subtle ways the avoidant can feel, even if they can't articulate. There's a quality to your interactions that's fundamentally different from before. You're pleasant and cordial, but no longer intensely focused on them. Your eyes don't light up when they enter a room the way they used to. Your voice doesn't carry the hope or hurt it once did. Your body language doesn't lean toward them seeking connection. You treat them with the same friendly neutrality you'd extend to an acquaintance, rather than the heightened emotion you direct towards someone who significantly impacts your life. This shift is viscerally noticeable to the avoidant, even though the changes are incremental and subtle. The authentic indifference that triggers obsession includes you genuinely not caring about their approval or opinion anymore. Their validation doesn't create satisfaction. Their criticism doesn't create hurt. Their attention doesn't make you feel special. Their neglect doesn't make you feel abandoned. They've lost the power to significantly affect your emotional state because they've become emotionally irrelevant to you. This loss of emotional power is profoundly disturbing to the avoidant who has relied on their ability to impact you as evidence of their importance. When they can no longer move your emotional needle in either positive or negative directions, they often become obsessed with regaining their power, with mattering to you again, with breaking through your indifference to create reaction. Your authentic indifference also means you're no longer trying to understand them, decode their behavior, or figure out their patterns. You've stopped the mental gymnastics of analyzing why they withdrew, what triggered their distance, what might bring them closer. You've stopped giving them hours of your mental energy trying to solve the puzzle of their inconsistency. This redirection of your cognitive resources away from them is noticeable because the avoidant is accustomed to occupying significant mental real estate in their partner's minds. When they sense they're no longer being obsessively analyzed and considered, when they recognize they're not consuming your thoughts, it triggers anxiety about their diminishing significance in your life. The indifference that creates obsession includes you not monitoring their behavior or keeping track of their patterns anymore. You're not noting how long it's been since they reached out. You're not tracking whether they're more distant this week than last week. You're not maintaining a mental record of promises made and broken. You've stopped keeping score because you've stopped being invested in the game. This lack of monitoring is actually threatening to the avoidant because it suggests you've detached enough that their behavior no longer matters enough to track. The recognition that you're not paying attention to them, that you're not invested enough to even monitor their patterns, often triggers increased efforts to recapture your attention. Your authentic indifference manifests in how you discuss the relationship or don't discuss it. You're no longer initiating conversations about where things are going, what the relationship means, whether the avoidant is capable of meeting your needs. You've stopped seeking clarity or commitment because you've reached genuine acceptance that what is and you're okay whether it changes or not. This cessation of relationship-defining conversations is paradoxically triggering for the avoidant because it suggests you've either made peace with the dysfunction or you've checked out emotionally. Either way, it indicates you're no longer fighting for the relationship, and the end of your fight often triggers the beginning of theirs. The indifference that makes an avoidant obsessed also includes you showing clear evidence that you're building a future that doesn't necessarily include them. You're making major decisions without consulting them. You're pursuing opportunities without considering how they'd impact the relationship. You're planning your life as though you're single, even if technically you're still connected. This forward movement without them integrated into your vision triggers panic in the avoidant because it makes concrete what was previously abstract, that you're moving on, that your life is progressing without them, that they're becoming part of your past rather than your future. This recognition often activates desperate pursuit as the avoidant attempts to reinsert themselves into a future you're no longer saving space for them in. Your authentic indifference is particularly powerful when the avoidant sees you thriving, radiating peace and happiness, clearly better off than you were during the relationship's difficult phases. They witness you laughing more freely, seeming lighter, appearing more alive. They recognize that your life improved when you stopped centering it around them, that you're flourishing in their absence in ways you couldn't while trying to accommodate their patterns. This evidence that you're better without them is ego-wounding, but also deeply attractive. The avoidant is drawn to the version of you that exists independent of them, the version that's whole and complete, the version that doesn't need them to be okay. This attraction to your independence often manifests as obsession, as the avoidant tries to access this more vibrant version of you. The authentic indifference that triggers obsession also includes you being completely unbothered by their attempts to elicit reaction. If they pull away, you don't chase. If they show interest in someone else, you don't experience jealousy. If they try to make you jealous, you remain unmoved. If they withdraw affection, you don't notice or care. Every strategy they've used to manage distance while keeping you engaged fails to produce the expected result because you've genuinely stopped caring enough to be manipulated. This imperviousness to their usual tactics forces the avoidant to either develop entirely new approaches or accept that they've lost their influence over you. And the former often manifests as obsessive pursuit as they desperately try to find something that breaks through your indifference. The authentic indifference that ultimately makes an avoidant obsessed is rooted in your genuine healing and growth rather than in strategy. You didn't cultivate indifference to manipulate the avoidant into pursuing you. You arrived at indifference through doing your own work, through building a life that fulfills you, through recognizing that your happiness doesn't depend on any specific person choosing you. This authenticity is what makes the indifference so powerful. The avoidant can sense that it's real, that it's not a game or a test, that you've genuinely released your attachment to the outcome. And this recognition that they're losing someone who has become genuinely independent of them, someone who no longer needs them, someone who is complete without them, triggers the avoidant's deepest fear of abandonment and activates pursuit patterns they've never demonstrated before. The obsession emerges not because you became more appealing, but because you became genuinely unattainable. Not because you played games, but because you stopped playing entirely. Not because you manipulated their psychology, but because you healed your own, and in your healing, you became someone the avoidant recognizes they're losing, not to another person, but to your own wholeness, which is a loss they suddenly realize they cannot tolerate, triggering the pursuit, the obsession, the desperate attempts to reclaim importance in your life, precisely because you've demonstrated you no longer need them to have importance in yours.